Neat fight and a late notice addition to our card as we have a big time banger at bantamweight between a couple of primary grapplers in Tony Gravely taking on El Toro, Anthony Birchak. And Matt, for Anthony Birchak, he was a late addition in his last fight. He was taking on Gustavo Lopez. It was on just a few days' notice. I was traveling. We did the video on split screen. Couldn't even be in person, but we got the job done. For Anthony Birchak, this is a guy that doesn't really have the greatest record in his last 5, let alone his last 7. And if you look at it, he had his first run in the UFC, lost his debut to Ian Entwistle, and he lost it emphatically, very, very quickly. He ended up going 2-2 in the UFC, and then he left on a win. You rarely ever see that, but Birchak was one of those guys. He went over to Ryzen, and then he lost 3 in a row, and then he ended up winning a few. He comes in here to the UFC, and he just gets absolutely obliterated by Gustavo Lopez. And it was one of those fights that, hey, Anthony Birchak, Division II wrestling, Greco-Roman type of guy. He's got all the grappling credentials in the world. When he came into the UFC the first time, he was a purple belt in jiu-jitsu. He's continued to really grapple with high-level guys. He goes to competition. He's a black belt at this point, trains out of 10th Planet in Tucson. But man, it's like those really, really high-level guys can still kind of beat him. And he's a good wrestler, but the high-level wrestlers can beat him. For Tony Gravely, I mean, an amazing record. A guy with tons of experience outside of the UFC. Oh, yeah. He was one of those fighters that you expected the promotion to sign. He comes in, and it's been an interesting kind of bag for him because you look at it, he beats Ray Rodriguez, who just recently got released by the promotion. He loses to Brett Johns in a fight that was ultimately very close, but for Brett Johns, a very, very good grappler at 135. Just cue up his heel hook win that he had, or his calf slicer. Whatever you want, Brett Johns, very good grappler. And then if you look at his last fight out, he won a split decision over Geraldo de Freitas, and I'll talk about the takedowns later on, but that is a primary version of Tony Gravely's grappling and his game. He's a guy that comes out of Virginia Tech. He's got great, great wrestling. Trains out of American Top Team now. And that was a main emphasis of his interview with our own JHK MMA. The fact that he's trying to gain some skills and incorporate them into his game from some of the guys he trains with at the gym. And we're talking big, big names. And I hate the name drop, but Tony did, so I will. Adriano Moraes, primary guy that he trains with. Pretty good knee over Demetrius Johnson. Can't do that against Anthony Birchak. He also trains with Kyoji Horiguchi and Pedro Munoz as well. You like to hear that. But for Birchak, this is a guy, real vet of the game. I love the matchup because it gives you a good idea of where each guy is in this division.
I do like the matchup. I might not be as hot on it as you are for this reason alone. I don't think Anthony Birchak's going to go on some big run, even if he is able to beat Tony Gravely. And I might be holding his old win, or his old loss, I should say, to Thomas Almeida against him, because that's immediately what I think of when I think of Anthony Birchak. I think of him as that opponent that they brought in to just get absolutely destroyed by Almeida, and that was the situation in that fight. And for Birchak, it is kind of weird, because we've seen him lose to different kinds of fighters. Let's say he only lost to primary wrestlers, then yes, this fight would just be awful for him against Gravely. But the fact that really good strikers can also just create a lot of distance between themselves and Birchak and force him to become a striker. It's kind of weird because he does have the jiu-jitsu credentials. His wrestling's good, but it's weird. He's one of these fighters who, his MMA wrestling, I would say, is good but not great, even though you look at his wrestling credentials and you would think, wow, this is one of the better MMA wrestlers out there. But he has been taken down and controlled by some other MMA wrestlers, if you will, and that's not going to pay him all that well against Tony Gravely, because the big knock against Gravely, if anything, is he wrestles too much. He just wrestles and wrestles and wrestles, and he can be one of those fighters who, okay, well, you stuffed my double leg, and now you stuff my double leg again. He'll really start to fatigue as the fight goes on, and you are starting to stuff those double legs. I'm not going to compare him totally to, like, a Marco Madsen. Where's he at, first of all? Because I'd love to see him back in the UFC.
Doing talk shows overseas.
There you go. I learned something new. But Gravely is one of those fighters who, if he does wrestle a little bit too much, he does kind of need to find that proper zone. He can't wrestle too much to where he's exhausted in that third round, and some of the submission ability of Birchak might be incorporated into this fight, but he can't just keep this fight on the outside and try to strike. It's not that Gravely's a poor striker by any means. Defensively, though, he does have a few lapses, and when he does lunge in with his strikes, because that's the big problem with Gravely, he's such this high-power athlete that when he does move forward, similar to his takedown attempts along with his punches, he will put everything behind them, and when he does fight those upper upper echelon strikers who have good takedown defense in this division. Think of guys like, Corey Sandhagen, if you will, kind of up the ladder a little bit. They will give him troubles. But the thing that I really like that you said about his training partners at American Top Team is this. Everyone you named has a different style. Pedro Munoz, great at jiu-jitsu, but he's got good kickboxing. Horiguchi has great boxing and kickboxing, but he's also a good wrestler. All those fighters have all these different wrinkles of their MMA games that I do think Tony Gravely can pick up on. And if you can incorporate striking and maybe a little bit better cardio along with his dominant wrestling, I do think we'll have a really good fighter here in Tony Gravely.
And for Gravely, it's going to be kind of important because you look at him, he's a short, not stocky guy, but he's a short guy for the division. Birchak's one of the taller guys, and if you're Gravely and just about every day you're training with the 7-foot tall bantamweight that is Adriano Moraes, it's going to be nice to go in there in the cage against a guy like Birchak and be somewhat familiar with it. But I really wanted to give you those numbers. He had 3 takedowns against Rodriguez. He had 5 against Brett Johns. He had 7 against De Freitas. That's insane. Now, he's one of those guys that likes to get on top and he wants to be heavy on top. I know we talked about that with JHK, but you can obviously tell that from any of the fights that you see. Against De Freitas, 7 takedowns, that's a high number. You're not getting a lot of time on top and getting that position. It'll be interesting to see how he makes out. I mean, he averages like 5.6 per fight, so it'll be interesting to see how the takedown defense of Birchak is, because you know that that's going to be the game plan from Gravely.
And the thing about Birchak, too, is with his submission ability, you kind of look at the cardio issues of Gravely. Stylistically, this should play into Birchak's hand, but my real issue is I don't know if he can get up off the bottom like we saw Gerald de Freitas do, like we have seen some of Gravely's opponents do. When Gravely is really heavy on top, yeah, there isn't always a lot of action going on. He can make fights somewhat stale, if you will, but it is effective. And when he is able to get on top of guys, for the most part, unless you are one of those other top tier wrestlers and grapplers, not saying that Birchak isn't, but again, we have seen his MMA wrestling might not be the great. I do see this being a very top control heavy fight for Tony Gravely.
Interesting thing before we flip it on over to the odds for the guy in Birchak who's originally supposed to fight a guy that was on UFC 2 and 3 and 4 and Johnny Eduardo. That fight fell out. So Birchak, it seemed like he was still going to fight on the pay-per-view, and then they kind of moved it around, and now he's here for Tony Gravely, who's supposed to fight this weekend against Nate Maness. What does Anthony Birchak do that's any better than Nate Maness at this point in his career? It's pretty tough.
Yeah, it really is. And again, I think this fight, I don't know if we're going to get a clear contender from this, but for Gravely, it will be interesting to see. If he goes out here and wins this fight in a way that we might have not expected, let's say his striking does look a lot better. He is able to tie his kicks in a little bit with his takedown attempts, and maybe the striking into the clinch work of Tony Gravely has improved. If we see those things from him, then maybe we could see him go on, I'm not saying a run to the top 10, but we might see him eventually be in there with some guys who are ranked, but I think this will be a really entertaining fight.
Could have Birchak playing spoiler as well with some of his defensive submissions, but if we have a look at the odds, it's fairly cut and dry. Gravely opened a minus 205 favorite, though. That line dropped significantly. He's now minus 320. And if you look at Birchak, he opened a plus 175. He's now at a plus 260 or thereabouts. Matt, the surprise for us all, we're going to bring up the Topology votes. Ooh, boy. 946 of them, 91% Gravely, 57% by decision. I'm in agreement with the fans. I'm in agreement with the odds. I'm going with Gravely as well. I mean, again, we normally lay it out a little bit more, for both guys, but for Birchak, we've seen him dominated by some primary wrestlers, and if you look at that win streak, yeah, there's some good wins. I mean, Adam Martinez, he finishes him. He finishes Rafael Montini de Lima, who was 6-2 at the time, and Eric Radlum coming into the UFC at 5-5. But it was quite a while ago. It's not the highest level competition. Exactly. And if you look at it for Gravely, the 5-on-in, we don't even have to focus on the 5-on-in. He beat a very, well-known up-and-comer that wasn't Ray Rodriguez, Draco Rodriguez, down with, another big promotion in King of the Cage. So for me, I've got Gravely in this one. I think his game plan will be implemented quite well against a guy like Birchak. Is that what you're thinking?
No, I do agree. I think Birchak might have a little bit of success in the grappling department, but round after round, I do just think the physical presence of Gravely might wear down on Birchak to the point where, yeah, Gravely might be tired in that third round, but if Birchak's constantly defending takedowns and trying to get up off his back, he'll also be pretty tired by that third round, so no, I agree. I like Gravely.
Both of us going with Tony Gravely to get the win. Really looking forward to this card. Our co-main event, a big one between Ricardo Close and Jeremy Stevens in the main event. Robert Whittaker taking on Kelvin Gastelum. Finally, really looking forward to it. Keep it locked in with Fight Night Picks, as we always say. Let's get into it.